Hi, everybody, and welcome to our November tea break. My name's Ella Brown. I'm the evidence researcher with the Evidence and Insight team at the Audience Agency. And we've got Oliver Mantell and Ben Jeffries here, who are going to be speaking to you. Well, Oliver presenting about initiators and responders, and we have a wonderful response from Ben Jeffries, our senior consultant. Just for the purposes of audio description, myself, Ella, is a white female in her mid-30s wearing a teal jumper. Oliver, if you'd like to introduce yourself.
Yes, hi, I'm a white male with blonde hair and also wearing a sort of tealy jumper, or sort of bluish tealy jumper. It's not uniform, it's just the way it turned out. So that's me, the sort of quite plain white room.
And Ben?
Hello, I'm Ben Jeffries. I'm a senior consultant with the Audience Agency, and I am a aging, white, balding, bearded man in a cardigan. And as I say it, I feel bad. I'm going to go and get changed.
Brilliant. So, yes, thank you again for joining us on our topic, which is initiators and responders. So we'll be talking about how many people take initiative when attending cultural events and organising for friends compared to those who tend to go along when someone else asks them. And I'll let Ollie take over from here.
Wow, cool. Thank you very much. So this little piece of analysis is something, in some ways, a little bit more experimental in as much as we're looking at something which I first saw years ago, done by the consultants WolfBrown. And I remember seeing it and thinking, that's a really interesting piece of research. I wonder what we're going to do with that, where it might go. And then it occurred to me recently that I didn't really remember seeing many people sort of getting the bit between their teeth and doing something more with it. And I thought, well, that's kind of curious and maybe a bit of a shame, because it's quite an interesting avenue to pursue. So this is our attempt to kind of bring it back into the limelight and see if anyone's sort of interested in looking at it a bit more and talk to us a bit more about it. So essentially, just to give you a sort of touch on what data we're using and what we're talking about. So we added a question into the Cultural Participation Monitor, our nationally representative survey. We've had a couple of questions, which allowed us to essentially replicate the question that had been asked by WolfBrown back in 2004, all that time ago, about whether people typically were the people that sort of initiated attendance or who responded to other people's invitation to go along to things. So for this particular wave, it's about just under 2,500 people. We've had another wave since then, but we're pouring back onto this one. And we could look at it and then get a broader sense of all sorts of different things about who these people were, what kind of profile they were. Also just use it as a hook, really, to start thinking about this question about how do you handle this kind of initiator-responder relationship. And I partly think it's a useful thing to look at because when this was first done in 2004, the whole marketing communications landscape was very different. And we've essentially moved from the kind of the standard web as was then to the social web now. And in some ways, that's much better suited to addressing this question. So there's going to be a question about, does that then play out in this scenario? So specifically, questions we asked were, to what extent do you agree or disagree with the following statement? Strongly agree, strongly disagree, obviously other options in between. I'm the kind of person who likes to organise outings to cultural events for my friends. Or, I'm much more likely to attend cultural outings if someone else invites me. So in theory, you could say you were strongly in favour of both of these, but in practice, most people tend to be one thing or the other, unsurprisingly. Lots of people gave kind of middling responses to these or particularly respond to them. So what we ended up with was about 8% of people strongly agreeing that they were an initiator, and about 13% of people strongly agreeing that they were a responder. So we take those as our kind of, if you like, our archetypal categories, is 8%, 13%. But because we've asked 2,500 people, 8% is still quite a lot. I won't do the mental maths in my head right now, but it's somewhere south of 240, obviously. So still reasonable numbers of people. And if we slightly loosen our definition and say, well, even just agreeing with it, then it gives you a bit of a sense they've got, if you like, initiator tendencies. That gets us up to a full third of people, or ideally almost 2/3 of people. Responder category. That was lower than they originally saw, which I suspect is a combination of, well, it could be Brits being less sociable. I mean, that is a fact we have to consider at least being possible. But it could also be a bit of a post-COVID thing. It could be a bit of a kind of, different methodology, ask for a general population rather than to a particularly sort of more core audience, etc. So there's different reasons why that might be lower. But in essence, there are some people who do skew towards these two extremes. If we look at them relative to audience spectrum, as we are wont to do, you see that there are lots of initiators amongst highly engaged groups, which kind of makes sense because they're really interested in the art form, they're knowledgeable, they're informed, they're engaged, they're passionate, they want to share it with other people, and so you have a higher proportion of people saying yes to that. But paradoxically, of course, if you've got lots of people in those groups who are initiators, that also helps bump up the figure who are responders, because there's lots of people trying to initiate their responses. So you do also get a reasonable number of responders. Amongst lower engaged groups, you get a much higher proportion of responders. They're less, on average, culturally motivated to go to these types of events, but they'll go if people are asking them. Is this kind of a bit more of the flavour, what's going on there? And of course, people in the middle, there's a bit less of any of that going on. So that's a kind of like a broad picture of what we're seeing in initiators and responders, but we can also cut it in various different other ways. So families, more likely to act as initiators. I guess maybe there's a kind of a proactive thing there about sort of trying to, sort of go out and do things while someone's babysitting. I'm sure that's easy to empathise, for at least for those of us that have a baby on their knee at the moment. But also, relatively higher on the responders as well. So I guess maybe you've got those kind of, I don't know, parent networks kicking in terms of, I don't know, babysitting exchanges or whatever. But also be partly an age thing in that some of the older groups we see have lower responses. Speaking of which, here is, if you like, the kind of the age pyramid for each of these two things. And we see that both of them taper down substantially as you get older. Now, I think there's probably two different things going on here. One of them is, I think there probably are more people that are behaving in these ways amongst younger groups. And some of that is about phrasing of the question involving things like, doing things with friends as opposed to doing things with, as couples or partners or whatever. So I think there's a little bit of that going on. And also potentially slightly different dynamics in terms of how people culturally engage. We will notice that kind of 45 as our kind of, break point in terms of behaviours that keeps coming up if you're a regular with some of the tea breaks. So there's a bit of that going on, but I think that what's also happening is there is a tendency for younger people to give stronger survey responses. So to some extent, you're more likely to be classified as an initiator as if your response to something where it's positive is hell yeah, as opposed to, well, yes, that's probably true. And there's a bit more of a tendency to do that amongst younger groups. So that's partly boosting those figures, just to caveat this a bit. I imagine no one under the age of 25 actually uses the phrase hell yeah, to be fair. So by and large, it's higher amongst younger groups, but also you can see that like the ratio tips a bit between the two groups. So lots of responders in the younger age groups, and as we saw, I think in the tea break where we're talking about interests and preferences, there's a bit more of a sense of people maybe following or absorbing lots of different options from people when they're in the younger age groups and starting to settle into more defined tastes and patterns and habits as they get a little bit more into the middle age groups. So there's probably a bit of that going on here, which is why maybe it drops from 23% to 17% for responders, but it stays, the initiator stays pretty standard there. But then finally, once you get to the older groups, the ratio of initiators drops substantially. So, fewer people initiating it at that point. Maybe people are more kind of, maybe, I don't know, coming to sort of mutual agreements on things as opposed to one person being the person that's kind of convening groups in the same way. So, Ella, I hope you're keeping an eye on the questions, or if there are any questions on the way through. So I'm not, I freely confess. The bar has disappeared for me. So what else do we know? By and large, we're seeing the initiators relative to the responders. They tend to be younger. They're more likely to be female. They're more likely to be in the highly engaged groups, but particularly the ones that are more prevalent in urban areas. And indeed, even on the lower engaged groups, we see a bit of a spike amongst some more kind of city-based groups. They tend towards higher education. They tend towards being really culturally engaged, particularly in the kind of art forms that we often see sticking out of profiles as the ones that are a bit of a tell in terms of people being sort of super into the arts as opposed to just sort of doing lots of cultural activities. So things like dance, classical music, events connected with books, etc. It's not necessarily that these groups are particularly about those things. It's just that really arty people are more likely to say yes to those because those are quite often more minority activities that are only done or are more often done by people who are very high engagement with culture in general. The other thing I think is quite interesting is that these are more engaged with social media, and their use of social media is a bit different. And again, there's lots of callbacks to previous tea breaks, just to prove the value of this as a series. But when we did the session about social media and we looked on why people were following cultural organisations, one of the things we said is that there's relatively few people that are following cultural organisations for information, and they're following because they're interested in the art form, they're interested in the subject. That's the kind of thing they're looking for, and therefore maybe there's a case to be beating people with that. The exception is the initiators, who, as a key and interesting group, want the information because they want to use it to then initiate engagement with other people. So they need the facts, they need the kind of like, when is it, where is it, how much is it, website with friends, other offers and deals and things from that perspective. So that's kind of an interesting kind of caveat to what we said earlier. Another reason, from a completely different data source, that I think this is potentially of interest in particular now, is when we looked at overall ticket sales across a standard cohort of organisations, so same organisations before COVID and after COVID, looking at how often or how many tickets they were booking in any given transaction from audience answers, we can see that small party sizes dropped very little, but individual tickets, couples and larger groups all dropped quite substantially. So it feels like there's maybe more of an opportunity amongst some of these kind of small group kind of bookings, and that now might be quite a good moment to really start to think about how to activate initiators and people encouraging peer groups or friends to engage. So what does it potentially mean? And do tell me if I'm rabbiting on too long, Ella. So I've lost my post-it note. So one key thing is, I think that an initiator-based approach to marketing, so thinking about focusing on the people who are then going to focus on other people or engage other people, is that it stops just being about an organisation relating to its audience, but recognising that its audience is also in a whole set of other relationships and networks and dynamics. So you have to be enabling those relationships as much as just having like the kind of first tier set of relationships. So if you imagine your organisation there in grey, that it has a direct relationship to, so that if that's a kind of, that's to like a more of a standard model. When we start thinking about initiators, we start thinking about some of those people you have contact with, bring in an extra shell of engagement that you don't have a direct contact to, but you do have contact through them, which then potentially means that how you contact those people should be about enabling that process as much as it's about convincing them individually. So if you've got people, for example, who are super highly engaged and they want to persuade their friends to come along, the things that might convince them personally might be quite different from the things that would persuade their friends. And they probably need access to that other information in order to get their friends to come along with. Because some of the very kind of maybe like art form specific stuff may be persuasive for them, but not necessarily everyone else. So what might that mean? Well, one thing I think there's a potentially quite a big opportunity, and I've not seen much of this happening. There is a scheme based in Berlin around classical music that's doing this, But in general, having a technology-enabled platform that encourages group booking by letting people sort of book and hold tickets and get other people to then book in and come into their party without them having to front up all the money in one go to start with, or indeed to enable and support people putting a call out on WhatsApp or other media to get other people to book into their individual party. That feels like a bit of a missed opportunity. It also maybe, so that affects a whole load of stuff around the messaging, but also the purchase process, the kind of customer journey stuff. It also might be thinking about not just what social media messages you put out, but what social media messages they want to put out, and therefore what you maybe need to enable them with or equip them with. And does that mean that you I don't know, produce customizable graphics that they can then tweak to send to their friends or something like that? You can, to some extent, identify initiators through the people who are kind of maybe first prompting sets of bookings, or who are currently having to book for small groups, even if they wouldn't necessarily choose to do that way. But it could be, we could do thinking about other ways of getting initiators to kind of show themselves, and that you can strengthen relationships with them, and potentially therefore differentiate the messaging. But beyond those practical things, I think there's probably lots of other practical implications, which I suspect someone like Ben will be well equipped to kind of direct us towards, or at least help us think about. I think there's some really kind of broad conceptual things that it's worth thinking about. So one is just this idea of understanding the kind of the way that we're situated within social networks, and the way that COVID has potentially disrupted a lot of those social networks. So we need to think about how to rebuild them or help to support them to be rebuilt. The other one is, if you think about attendance in terms of those networks, then the cost of the transaction is much more about time and money, which is the thing we often talk about. It's about reputation, it's about relationships, it's all those kind of hard to define things. I'm sure we've all had situations where we've invited friends along to something that they thought, oh yeah, I think this would be really good, and your friends come along, and it's the longest hour and a half of your life where you sit there thinking, God, this person next to me absolutely hates this. So there is, there's that to think about. And how do you manage that? How do you mitigate that? How do you direct people to go? Essentially, it's not just if you like the art form, you're like this, but this is kind of safe to bring someone else to, and you're not going to feel stupid. Bit of experience, I'll tell you about it sometime. So yes, shift from communication to communication support. So a slightly different way of maybe imagining the role of communications, and that it's about participating in the community rather than just having particular customer relationships. And then finally, that thing I touched on right at the outset, really, about the idea that it's, if you like, more of a socially native way of thinking and engaging, as opposed to being kind of like digital. We have a platform, we push things out through it in standardized forms. So yes, there you are. So a sort of some prompts and thoughts around the way that we might want to think about initiators. And I will hand over to Ben for some reflections.
Reflections from me. I think it's if you want to go actually bring that slide back up, because I think those are the prompts for discussion. As Ollie was saying in his intro, the idea of initiators and responders is not new. It came out of research done by the Knight Foundation with orchestras in America in 2004. And what's new here is the correlation, or the indication of correlation, with segmentation, which may help us identify who these people are in our own databases. It raises some interesting questions. So in those low engaged segments, relatively few doing the initiating and a lot of responding, which perhaps connects with some of the things that are going on around things like ambassador models in audience development. That the gold dust nature of initiator within some groups means that identifying them becomes very important if you're doing audience development with hard to reach groups. And in higher age groups, the suggestion that conveners are crucial, particularly now, potentially magnifying a positive impact post-COVID, that you the sense that people haven't been attending for a while and need they're not disenfranchised from the art form, but they need that prompt from the fan among your group, that passionate person to make that response. Means that it feels like it is a good time to revisit this. As I say, not new idea, but one that feels like it might have a particular power now. Identifying seems, if anything, made slightly easier by a segmentation correlation, although it's probably relatively easy to see people who come more than once, so are likely to be people who are initiators for your organization already, who are bringing groups probably between 3 to 8, who is likely to be a sort of family group. So while there is likely to be an initiator in there, we're talking about people who reach beyond their immediate. And that's quite a small number in most databases, I would think, to focus on. If you took 3 to 8 people who book more than once in groups of 3 to 8 or 4 to 8, that's probably a manageable number to target efforts on, I would think, for most people. And as Ollie was saying, what's also new since this was first raised as a potential approach people could use is the power of digital social networks to support this behavior, whether as an initiator, with the power of summoning provided by the social web, your initiation can reach further, more frequently, more often, can initiate more activities than before, or the responder, who's obviously connected to more initiators or in daily contact than ever before. And in between these is sort of the Uber initiator or the influencer, who many of us probably are possibly through press activities or that grey area between press and marketing, trying to engage. And it's interesting to look at how, as I was thinking about this, I was thinking about that process of working with influencers or inviting influencers. You've got a clear goal to reach their audience, and what they do to do that is they mediate your message for their audience. Often they describe the experience you offer in the ways their audiences respond to, and this will depend on the influencer you're engaging with, but it tends to be more familiar, tends to be more context focused, the building, the drinks offer, the experiential bonus, and what changes can we make in the materials we put out to help that initiator experience, which we consciously do when we're working with influencers or targeting particular press or promoters to reach out to their groups, but we don't necessarily translate into our comms with our audiences. So those are my couple line thoughts.